Hi, I'm Chris Ralph, the professional prospector, and I'm going to do a series on indicator hacks of how to find gold. Now, I'm out here actually at an old gold mine. This mine was worked actually around the turn of the century, the early 1900s, and then again in the 1980s. And there's been some nice gold here, and hey, I myself have found some nice gold here. So I'm going to talk about what kind of indicators and hacks that you would use to figure out, if you came out to an old gold mining area, where are the areas that you would look in an area? Because this is many acres. Would you just look any old place everywhere? It's something that you want specific things that you can look for. So I've got 10 indicator hacks for going to existing old placer areas that will indicate for you where the gold is likely to be. And we're going to start off with number one right now. So my first indicator hack that I'm going to talk about is ground cuts. I'm standing in a ground cut right now at this mine. There's a cut going up this way and a cut going up that way, other ones over there, crisscrossing over between. These are cuts that the miners cut out to dig their gold-bearing gravels. And so when you see ground cuts like this, a whole series of them, not just one, because people might have cut a trench to drain water from something, but when you see a whole series of them interwoven and cutting across each other with piles of dirt and that kind of stuff, that's a good indicator hack that's going to tell you that there's gold in this area because, well, the miners work this area, and what you want to look for is maybe little knolls that the miners, they cut here, they cut there, and maybe between the cuts there'll be little knolls or little flat tops, and those are some of the good places to take your metal detector and go searching. So this is one of those little hillocks. You see there's a drainage that goes right in front of me, there's one that goes right behind me, and you can see there's a little hill right here behind me that is the little mound between the drainages. And it's along the top of these things. Often you'll see rocks stacked upon them. It's along the top of these that are good places to prospect, and that's one of your indicator hacks for gold. Now, another thing I want to talk about is what they call stacked rock piles. In very narrow drainages where you have like a little stream or a little gully, a lot of times the miners just didn't have a lot of place to put the rocks. And so they would choose one wall or the other of the little narrow drainage, and they would literally stack in an organized way the rocks along that side. And oftentimes, underneath those stacks, there's decent gravel and decent gold. Even if the gut of the stream has been cleaned completely, underneath that specifically stacked wall of rocks, you'll find oftentimes some pretty decent gold. I know of some guys who's actually had some really good success with that.
So here is an example of one of those carefully stacked rock, basically rock walls. You can see that the rocks in the center, you've kind of lost part of the wall, but on either side the miners carefully stacked the rocks, and oftentimes this was done because of a narrow gully or a narrow way through a drainage that they didn't have room, and so they stacked the rocks carefully on the edge. And oftentimes under these rocks, under the stacked rock wall, is a really good place to look for gold because it contains dirt and gravel that the miners didn't actually work. They stacked their rocks on top of unworked gravel.
Okay, another one of my old-time placer miner sign indicator hacks is stacked boulders like this. You see, this is an old placer area. The old-time miners, actually, they took out several thousand ounces of gold out of this general area, and when they worked their gravels, they had to run it through a sluice box and to recover the gold. And what they did, there was always rocks that were too big to go through the sluice box, so they pitched them up in a pile like this. Now, I mentioned before areas that were really tight and they had to perfectly stack them up because they didn't want to take up any more room than they had to. But these ones, they just pitched them in a pile. And actually the truth is, around the edges of these piles and underneath these piles are really good places to find nuggets. I've found some nice nuggets just taking piles like this and tossing them aside, moving them out. Because the old-time miners, even in areas like this where there's plenty of room, they still had to put the rock someplace, and a lot of times they buried areas where there was some decent nuggets. So remember this indicator hack, the piles of stacked rocks. Okay, so I want to show you, as one of our other indicator hacks, an area that's been stripped of its ground. Now you can see here's a little drainage right here where the old-time miners dug this out, and right behind me is an area that they've stripped the ground off. You can see the rocks and stuff that they left behind. They stripped this area, and things are starting to grow back now because it's been decades since there was any work here, but they've stripped this area off and left some material, but they mined most of the material off the top because it had gold in it. Well, what normally happens with these things is that there's oftentimes gold even deeper than what they stripped off. So this is a great indicator hack of a place to take your metal detector or other digging things that you're going to do in your search to find gold, because this is something that the miners left behind for you. Okay, so I wanted to show you another little cleared area. You can see the area cleared around me where I'm standing. Actually, this little cleared area was something that the miners cleared off in the old days and left a lot of gold behind. You see, they couldn't tell. They didn't have metal detectors to know what they were, clearing off, or whether they got all the gold or just most of the gold. And this is an area where I've taken more than 50 gold nuggets out of just a small area right behind me. The biggest nugget that's come out of here has been 1/4 of an ounce, although most of them were about 1/2 gram or even some less. So, but there was a huge number of nuggets. This is what was called a patch, and there was a lot of gold came out of this spot. So when I talk about those cleared areas in a gold mining zone where people have worked in the past, that's a good place to look. I know what I'm talking about. Okay, so another one of my indicator hacks for finding gold is dams and water areas. So what's behind me, you can see there's an area of piled dirt. There's more area of piled dirt over here. There's actually more area behind over here that's piled dirt. This is an area that was used for water storage, and they would use that water to wash the gravels to recover the gold. So this was something the miners had to have so that they could reuse their water, and they could, a lot of these areas, even if you're in the mountains, there's not huge amounts of water, and so they had to kind of conserve their gold, and so, or conserve their water, and so they had areas of water storage and dams and ponds, and those are good indicators that there's gold in the area. And oftentimes when they dug these ponds up, they dug up some gold-bearing gravel too, and so checking around the walls of some of these ponds is a good thing to do, and something that will help you find some gold. Another good gold hack indicator. Here is that area I'm just panning across and showing you how this is a water storage dam that they used to retain water for their placer working. Another important indicator hack that I want to show to you is dry washer piles. A lot of times in the desert, you don't see dry washers so much in the mountains like this. In desert areas, they'll work gravels using what they call a dry washer. And finding old dry washer piles can be a real key to finding gold nuggets, because a lot of times the dry washer wasn't very efficient, and so going around old dry washer piles with your metal detector, or taking some more, even doing some more dry washing yourself, can be very productive. It certainly has for me. So let me show you some more about that right now.
Here is an old-time picture of some dry washers taken maybe a century ago, but it shows something about dry washing that I want you to observe. Notice that the gentleman in the front of the dry washer with the dark vest, who's shoveling materials in, that next to him in front of the dry washer is a pile of coarse material. And then behind the dry washer, what's come out the sluice basically end of the dry washer is some fines. The fines are what's actually been processed. The coarse material actually goes over a screen and gets rejected. Only the fine material gets processed. This is a characteristic of dry washing, that you have these coarse, located piles of material, both coarse and fine, that are right almost next to each other. Depending on how the dry washer is designed is how close the fines and the coarse will be next to each other, but they're often very close. Sometimes in old dry washer piles, the fines will get blown or washed partly away and will be hard to observe, but you'll still see this coarse and fine together. I'm going to show you an example from Nevada of just this sort of thing, looking at dry washer piles that were done most of a century ago. Okay, here's an area in which some dry washers worked, perhaps in the teens, 20s, maybe as late as the early 30s, but it was done sometime in that kind of time frame. You'll note various piles of coarse material and fine material. Let me point some of these out to you. All right, you'll see on the left some fines and some coarse right next to each other. Those are labeled, and it really is clearly dry wash tailings. You have some stacked rocks that the miners pulled out of the drainage itself, which runs through the front there, but up above in the gray area where I have it labeled more dry wash tailings, there are more sets of coarse and fine located right next to each other. This is an area that was dry washed by old-time miners looking for gold. And it is a great indicator hack that the gold is in the area, because the old-time miners put in some significant area or some significant work here to get the gold out.
Another great indicator hack that you might want to pursue to find gold is basically shafts that the miners put down in the gravel to reach bedrock. It's well known that in most placer areas, the gravel right on bedrock or very close to it is going to have a lot more gold in it. That's something you should know and remember. But in areas where the gravel is deep down, you may have, a lot of desert areas may have 10, 15, 20, even more feet down from the surface down to bedrock. And so the miners would put in shafts down, like I say, 20, 30, sometimes even more. And one of the things that I've found about those shafts is, one, is they indicate that there's gold there, because the miners wouldn't do that much work if they weren't getting some out of it. But the other thing is that a lot of times the spoil pile around the hole where, and sometimes there's not even a hole left, there's just a depression. The pile of the material that they took out of the hole when they were digging that shaft down to bedrock, a lot of times that pile will have gold in it. And I found some good nuggets in the desert areas actually testing the dump or spoil pile, whatever you want to call it, of the shafts that the miners put down to reach bedrock. And I'm going to show you a little bit more about that right now.
So this is what I mean by those kind of shafts that the miners would put down to bedrock. You can tell that the miners put in a lot of work digging something like this. This just wasn't something they did on a lark or a speculation. And when they went down, they knew there was some good gold down at bedrock. So the edges of these things, the hole itself, of course, is extremely dangerous. This is a vertically sided hole, and if you got close to that and slipped, you'd be falling to your death. But the outside parts of this, the last material that the miners threw out as they were reaching down to the bedrock, just before they got to bedrock, the material that they threw out often has some decent nuggets, and I've actually gotten some pretty good gold going around to places like this, and just detecting around the edges of these on the outside where the miners were digging. And this holds true even for things like the miners digging out ravines, not just a shaft down to the bedrock. If they're digging out a ravine and tossing the material to the side, you see the miners threw this material off to the side thinking that it wasn't particularly good, but there might be a nugget or two in there. and they had nothing like a metal detector that they could use to check to see if their spoil piles had any nuggets in them. So this is what I mean by a great indicator hack of a good place to look for finding nuggets with your metal detector or any other means with a dry washer or panning, sluicing, whatever.
Another thing that is a good indicator that's more modern, a more modern indicator gold hack is what they call dozer scrapes. And in some areas where people have worked in the past by dry washing or done other things, if they metal detect it and find some really nice nuggets there, a lot of times if the gravel's a little deeper, they'll come in with some sort of heavy equipment and scrape off the material, and you see, a metal detector will only see so deep, especially if you're just going after small gold. And so if you know that you've well detected the surface 6 inches, well, you could take a bulldozer and scrape off those 6 inches and detect down deeper. And some places, where it's deeper, a foot or two or whatever, there may not be a lot of gold up at the top. Most of the gold may be on bedrock, and so you'll see people scrape off a foot or two, or sometimes even more, of material to get down to the bedrock. And so when you see that in certain areas, that's a good indicator hack that some decent gold has been found there, and you might want to detect with your detector around those piles that they pushed up from the side. And even in the areas of the bedrock that they exposed, because I've actually done really good doing that in some places, just detecting around those areas.
Okay, so I wanted to show you some photographs of dozing for gold. Basically, this is a gullyway in Nevada where there was known to be gold, and there had been gold found for many years, but the gravel was several feet deep, and the best gold, of course, is going to be on bedrock. So a group of guys came in and they got all their permissions and permits and that sort of thing, and they brought in an old, basically pretty inexpensive bulldozer and went through and scraped off all the material down to the bedrock. And when they got down to bedrock, they found gold. Basically, this wash had been full of trash, and by scraping off down a couple of feet to bedrock, they basically eliminated almost all the trash. And in a half day, when I was up there watching them work, they recovered actually more than an ounce of gold. So a pretty good investment, and they showed me some other really nice gold that they had found in previous sessions when I was there. So they were doing really well. Here's another shot taken in an old hydraulic pit in California, where the operators went into an area that had produced a little bit of gold and scraped off the old tailings and piles of rocks that were there, and found some very nice gold on the bedrock. They scraped off all the loose material down the bedrock, and they recovered dozens and dozens of small nuggets. So this technique of bulldozing off the waste material, if you see it done, people were getting probably some very nice gold, and it was well worthwhile.
Another indicator hack that you want to check out is old-time hydraulic workings. The miners of the old days, they could kind of do whatever they wanted, and the environmental regulations weren't strict, and so they did some kind of damaging stuff, probably some stuff they probably shouldn't have done. And they were able to use high-pressure water to just blast down the sides of hills. They tore up a lot of ground doing that, but they often left a lot of gold behind. And I've found some really nice gold metal detecting and dry washing and doing some other stuff in old hydraulic workings that were left behind by the miners. You ought to check out those too, because in a number of states, there's quite a few of them. I mean, there's even a few in Nevada where there's not much water, but mostly they're in places like California and Oregon. In California, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of these old hydraulic workings that you might want to check out as a good place to find gold.
Hydraulic pits are a big thing in California where they work the old tertiary rivers that were filled with ash and sand and that sort of thing, but had pretty good gold down on the bedrock. In these areas, the old miners literally were taking off sometimes several hundred feet to get down to the bedrock. And there are hundreds of these pits throughout California, but hydraulic mining was popular throughout the West wherever there was gold-bearing gravel and enough water to work it. Here's another shot of a pit, basically the bedrock, and you'll see that the miners toss their cobbles into piles usually, and both around the edges of these piles and in between them, the bedrock that's exposed, it's very common that there's small nuggets of gold that were left behind, and sometimes some pretty decent sized ones as well. So these old hydraulic pits are very productive for modern prospectors. And in fact, here's another old prospect pit and a meeting when a number of prospectors got together, and they're all digging in the bank there at an old hydraulic pit, and they were all getting pretty decent gold. Not all hydraulic pits are tertiary gravels. Sometimes there are other types of pits that are operated that are smaller in size. This is actually working a glacial moraine type of material, kind of semi-residual, semi-moraine that had accumulated, and the miners came in there with their water and washed away hillsides, and you see the cobble piles that are left behind. So these are still pretty big, not quite as big as some of the tertiary river pits, but still large. There are also small pits perched along benches along rivers. This is perched along a modern river. The river has cut down far enough that this old bench was no longer in the area where the river flowed, but it wasn't more than about 40 or 50 feet above the modern river where the surface of the river was. So the early day miners diverted water and brought it in by a ditch, and were able to wash this material and recover the gold that was on the bedrock of this small bench. This small bench only occupies perhaps an acre or an acre and a half. So hydraulic pits and hydraulic benches and areas where the old timers mined are very productive and well worthwhile for the prospector to check out.
Now, if you want to become a better prospector for yourself, I've written a book about prospecting. It's like an encyclopedia. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my book right now.
Okay, so I wanted to tell you a little bit more about my book. I wanted to be able to share the knowledge that I've gained about finding gold and how to be successful. And so I spent years literally writing this book, Fistful of Gold. It's more than 350 pages long, which is why I say it's an encyclopedia of everything you need to know about finding your own gold. I've sold more than 8,000 copies, and I've got a lot of really great feedback on it. It just is the most complete book on the market. It has information about finding gold that literally is not available in any other book that you're going to find for prospectors, because I took technical stuff from geologists and other mineral scientists, and I've translated that into language that the average guy can understand. You don't need a PhD to go out and find gold, but the information that scientists have learned over recent decades can be of a lot of help to people. So it's in this book. If you're interested about finding gold, panning, sluicing, nugget detecting, dry washing, the geology of gold deposits and how they form, it's all in here. And like I say, it's more than 350 pages long. So if you'll just go to the description underneath this video, you can take a look. I've got a link in there to take you to Amazon, to the site where the book is sold. And I think you'll really enjoy it. Take a look at all the people who've commented on this and have really liked the book. It has a very, very high rating for a book. And also, I have a website, my own free website that you can take a look at. I've got all kinds of information on here about doing research and how to find gold, a lot of good information, stuff that basically couldn't fit into my book. And so I put it on this website, and I have a link also for that in the video description. So take a look in the description, and you can click on the link, and it'll take you to my website. And finally, if you like this presentation, I've got a lot more coming out. Here's a 3.5 ounces of gold that I found a couple years back in one area. I've got a lot more of these videos coming on gold, gemstones, hard rock, placer, a lot of metal detecting. There'll be lots of metal detecting stuff. So if you really enjoyed this, click the subscribe button and then tick the notification bell off, and YouTube will let you know when I publish new stuff. And hit the like button as well. And please comment on these videos, because I'm interested in what you have to say, and I promise to answer any questions you have. So if you are wondering about anything, or think maybe I didn't cover something thoroughly enough in a video, then let me know, and I'll be happy to try and help you out and give you whatever information you need. So thanks a lot, and hope you enjoyed this, and we'll see you again real soon.